Hello, welcome to my channel on the apparently never-ending series about the Beauty Bay Wilderness palette. I feel like a connection with this palette, a love for this palette that I haven't experienced in a while with many palettes. I feel probably have also said that about like so many palettes. Anyway, I feel like at this point you guys know what it looks like. I posted a first impressions on this, and the last video that I posted, if everything goes right, should be a 4 looks 1 palette using this palette. But I thought, new concept for me, I thought I would do a swatch comparison video with this palette and the Melt, Muerte, and Vida palettes, because I've seen so many comments, and I mean I agree as well, that there are like, it gives similar vibes to the Muerte palette, and I actually think there's a lot of other shades that correspond to the Vida palette as well. Like, it definitely is like blue and red like the Muerte, but I think like some of the reds and other shades are comparable to the Vida palette as well. So I know that a lot of people missed out on these. I'm like so grateful and happy that I had managed to like get both of these before they were gone. So I do have both of them, and I thought that it might be helpful if you were lusting after one of these and you weren't able to get it, or you know, there's like a shade in each of these palettes that you wish you had or something like that, like just to see how close these shades actually are. I thought that might be fun and helpful. Hopefully this video won't be too long. There's construction outside and I'm like desperately trying to get this filmed while they're on their lunch break because it's almost noon. So yeah, let's just get into it. I think that I might just like go through each of the shades in here and then swatch the corresponding Melt shades. I think that makes sense, and I'll probably do like close-up individual swatches on my hand as well. So first is the shade Snow, which is basically just like a white, slightly off-white beige shade, and there's honestly nothing like that in either of the Melt palettes. Maybe in the Vida there's this shade called Atoll. Also, I'm sorry for Spanish pronunciations, I don't know how to speak Spanish at all, but this is definitely darker. It's like a brown, a light brown, whereas the Snow shade is definitely like a white. Next we have the shade Sky, which is like a light blue. Again, there's really nothing in either of the Melt palettes that match this or are similar to this. Same with the shade Ray, which is this like greeny gold duochrome metallic shade. Ray's a special guy. There's nothing like him in either of the Melt palettes. Then we have the shade Twilight, and there's definitely a similar shade in the Melt Muerte palette, this dark blue called Noche Eterna right here. So I'm gonna swatch these two. I'm just gonna do them on my arm. So this is the Beauty Bay shade Twilight. I mean, the formulas are not the same. I actually think they're quite different. But I think like the Beauty Bay palette or formula is probably a little bit easier in general to use. And then this is the shade Noche Eterna from Melt. So not quite exactly the same. Twilight is definitely a lot brighter, whereas Noche Eterna is darker, duskier, not quite as bright, definitely more of like a true navy blue. But I mean, they'll give you similar vibes. Noche Eterna is just going to be deeper. The next shade in the Melt palette is the shade, in the Beauty Bay palette is the shade Ocean right here. That's a metallic, darker metallic blue. And then the similar shade that I could tell, and the similar shade in the Muerte palette as well is the shade, what is this? CATRINA. It's like a dark blue with almost like a black base and like a blue sparkle. So this is the shade Ocean from the Beauty Bay palette. Really sparkly, has like a green sparkle to it and almost like a purpliness to it as well. And then this swatch underneath it is the shade CATRINA from the Melt palette. So again, like similar-ish vibes, but definitely not the same shade. Again, the Melt shade is a lot deeper. Has basically a black base, I would say, and then has blue sparkle to it, whereas the Beauty Bay one is definitely greener and, like I said, has like almost like a purpliness to the blue. I honestly think that I prefer the metallic, the ocean shade in the Beauty Bay palette, just because it is like sparklier and a little bit, it's not quite as intensely dark. Next shade in the Beauty Bay palette is the shade Forest. There's really nothing that I could tell that was like this shade in either of the Melt palettes. Then we have the shade Breeze, which is a metallic teal, and the shade Angelito from the Melt palette is what I think is probably going to be most similar. So this is the shade Breeze from the Beauty Bay palette, really pretty sparkly teal shade, and then the shade Angelito from the Melt palette here. So they're both like definitely metallic teals, you know. I don't love the Melt formula, particularly in the Muerte palette. I don't think it's amazing. Again, I definitely prefer the Beauty Bay shimmer. It has like a little bit of gold in there, like a gold sparkle. The Melt palette is definitely not quite as sparkly, and there's not really any like dimension to it. It's just like a metallic teal. So again, definitely prefer the shimmers, I think, across the board from the Beauty Bay palette. Then we have a matte shade. This is the shade Mint, which is a matte light mint shade, and the shade Lagrimas from the Muerte palette from Melt I think is gonna be similar. So this is the shade Mint. From the Beauty Bay palette, and then this is Lagrimas from Melt. So Lagrimas is definitely more pigmented for sure, a little bit deeper, a little bit brighter. Again, similar vibes, you could use them in similar ways. I do prefer the Melt shade in this case, but they're both like kind of like tealy, minty shades. Next we have the shade Moss. I don't really think there's anything similar. There's not really like a dark metallic green in either of the Melt palettes. Then we have the shade Ivy, which is a dark foresty green, almost like a darker teal. And then the shade Duelo from the Melt palette right here is again like a darker teal. So this is the shade Ivy. This is probably the darkest shade in the Beauty Bay palette for sure. And then this shade Duelo from Melt. This is probably the closest so far. They look really similar. I would say Duelo is maybe like a touch more green. Like there's almost like a more of like a, no. I would say that Duelo is has a little bit more almost like blue to it, like a little bit more of a darker teal, whereas Ivy in comparison looks almost like more of a true like foresty green. But I think like they're very, very similar, and you probably couldn't really tell the difference on the eyes if I'm being completely honest. Next we have the shade Lime, and I think that this is where we start to get into the Vida palette obviously from Melt, oh my god, where the shade Serape is a brighter metallic green, and I think that's probably the closest that you're gonna get. So this is the shade Lime. I love this shade. I think it's so beautiful. And then we have the shade Serape from Melt. So not quite the same. Sorry. No, it doesn't matter. They're both metallic greens, but not quite the same tone at all. Lime almost has like more olive to it, whereas Serape is just like a bright green. But they looked like they could be similar-ish. Next we have the shade Leaf. There's really, I don't think, anything similar in either of the Melt palettes, and same with the shade Eucalyptus. Not really anything very similar in the Melt palettes either. The shade Marigold is like a mustard. I might compare this to the shade Soul from the Vida palette. I don't think that they're gonna be very similar. Please excuse the truck outside. Marigold has like a good amount of orange to it, so I thought that Soul might be a little bit similar. And you know what? They definitely give similar vibes. Again, similar vibes. Whereas this is, Soul is a little bit brighter, definitely like a light orange, whereas Marigold has like a bit of more of a mustardy, like brownness to it, but they're actually more similar than I thought they might be. Next up, we have the shade Fossil from the Beauty Bay palette, which is a beautiful, like, sparkly, goldy bronze shade. That's what I have on my inner corners and in the center of my eyes. And I thought that perhaps the closest shade would be the shade Calaca from the Muerte palette, which is right here. I don't think they're going to be super similar, but I thought I could just compare them anyway. Fossil is super bright, super beautiful, really sparkly as well. And then Calaca I actually really don't like that much, to be honest. It's just like a light, like champagne goldy shade. It's pretty crumbly. It's not that like bright and intense of a shimmer, so it's just okay. Next up we have the shade Poppy from the Beauty Bay palette, and definitely the shade that's going to be most similar. Well, actually there's two I might compare to. So there's this bright red shade from the Vida palette called Mexicana, and then there's also this shade from the Muerte palette called Corazon. So I'm going to swatch both of those, I think. I'm going to just move over to my other arm because I'm running out of space. So we have the shade Poppy from the Beauty Bay palette. It's I'm also wearing this in my crease today. It's such a beautiful bright red. Then we have the shade, let's see, Corazon from the Muerte palette, which is the next one. Definitely similar, more pigmented though, and a little bit deeper. And then we have the shade Mexicana from the Vida palette. So this is brighter, for sure, a little bit less pink, I want to say. I would say that Corazon is definitely more similar in tone to Poppy, for sure. And then we have the shade Raw from the Beauty Bay palette, which is like a burgundy shade. I think the shade Sangre from the Muerte palette right here is going to be the most similar, although definitely I can already guess that it's going to be deeper. So this is the shade Raw. And then this is the shade Sangre. So again, like, they're similar tonally, but really not that similar because Sangre is so dark. Then we have the shade Heat, which is a metallic red, and I'm going to compare this to Alegria from the Vida palette. Already I can kind of guess that Heat is going to be, I think they're going to be different in tone. Heat is what I'm wearing all over my lids today. Such a beautiful red. And then we have Alegria. So yeah, they're really not the same at all. Alegria is almost more of like an orange. And then we have the shade Earth, which is a warm toned brown. There's really nothing like this in any of the Melt palettes. And then lastly, we have the shade Sunrise, which is a matte, like mid-toned orange. Oops, and I'm going to compare this to the shade Pan Dulce, right here, this other orange shade from the Vida palette. So this is Sunrise. Oops. Ignore the smudge that I just made of blue on the bottom part of my arm, please. Sunrise, and then Pan Dulce. So again, like, these are pretty similar. Sunrise is also a little bit lighter in tone, and Pan Dulce is definitely more pigmented. Looking at this palette, I might swatch one more. I think the shade Eucalyptus, which is this like mossy green here, might be kind of similar to the shade Agua Ardente, which is like a brown, but it's kind of a greeny brown. So I'm just gonna see what they look like. So this is Eucalyptus. This is definitely not like an exact, it's kind of just like what's similar. And then the shade Agua Ardente. So it definitely looks kind of like an army green, Agua Ardente, but kind of similar, I guess, to Eucalyptus. Let me just swatch the shade Leaf from the Beauty Bay palette. Yeah, so not quite really the same at all. Actually, and in comparison to Leaf, let me also swatch this bright green called Papel Picado. I don't think they're gonna be the same because Papel Picado is like super bright, but let's just see. Yeah, so they're both lighter greens, but Papel Picado is like almost a neon green, and Leaf is definitely more of a mossy green. Please excuse the fact that I smudged that over the blue. But yeah, so I hope that this was like a short and sweet, hopefully helpful video. If anyone was like wondering about any of like shade comparisons between the two palettes, because I do have both of them, you can definitely see there's a lot of similar shades. Similar shades, similar vibes, like you honestly can't deny that at all. If you watch me, you know that my channel is not about comparisons necessarily. I'm not trying to like dupe things out all the time. I like to like enjoy my makeup, and frankly, I'm not super bothered if there's like super similar shades between palettes that I have or whatever, but I know that a lot of people are, and also you can't get these matte palettes anymore. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully, you know, you enjoyed this a little bit, but I think you could definitely get similar looks, similar vibes to any look that you could create using the melt palettes. There are like obviously other shades in the melt palettes that you don't have in the Beauty Bay palette, but I think it's the closest, frankly, that I've ever seen. The only thing I think, the main thing for me that is missing is melt gives you like such rich, deep mattes, and Beauty Bay just didn't quite have that in this palette. And you know me, I'm all for deep mattes, but definitely good option, and just a good palette, honestly, on its own. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I hopefully will see you guys next time. Bye!